I spent 20 years driving a truck across this country to build $4.5 million, and I found out my kids had been spending it for 2 years before I ever knew. I didn't say a word. The night I found out was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get in a small house off a 2-lane road in Ohio. No traffic, no voices, just the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the sink. I had just come back from a long-haul run, Chicago to Dallas and back, nearly 1,800 miles in 4 days, my back stiff, my hands still remembering the steering wheel. I poured myself a cup of coffee even though it was past 9 at night, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop the same way I had done thousands of times before. I wasn't looking for anything unusual. Just checking my accounts, making sure everything was where it should be, something I had learned to do after years of living on the road. Numbers don't lie, that's what I always told myself. People might, but numbers don't. The screen loaded slowly, and for a moment everything looked normal. Then I saw it. I blinked once, then leaned closer. The balance didn't make sense. I refreshed the page. It was lower. Much lower. I felt my fingers go still on the trackpad. I checked again, same result. I opened another account, then another. Each one told the same quiet story. Money had been moving. Not all at once. Not in one big transfer that would have set off alarms. No. This was careful. Small amounts, steady, over time. 2,000 here, 5,000 there, 10,000 at a time. Enough to disappear into the noise if you weren't paying attention. Enough to drain everything if you waited long enough. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. 20 years of early mornings, late nights, truck stops, cold sandwiches, and missed birthdays. 20 years of choosing work over comfort, saving instead of spending, telling myself it would all be worth it someday. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I didn't even feel angry, not yet. I just sat there and listened to the silence in my own house. I thought about my son, Jason, the way he used to wait by the window when I came home from a run, the way he would run out to the driveway like I had been gone for years instead of days. I thought about my daughter, Emily, how she used to draw pictures of my truck with big crooked wheels and stick figures inside. Back then, everything I did made sense. Every mile, every sacrifice. It all had a purpose. I looked back at the screen, at the numbers that no longer added up. And something inside me shifted, quiet, but permanent. I closed the laptop slowly, wrapped both hands around my coffee mug, and stared at the dark window over the sink. My reflection looked older than I remembered. Tired, yes, but not broken. Not yet. Because in that moment, I realized something important. They didn't take my money all at once. Which meant they thought I wouldn't notice. Which meant they thought I wasn't paying attention. And that was their first mistake. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was shocked, but because my mind kept moving through memories I had not looked at in years, the kind of memories you push aside when you are too busy surviving. I sat in that same kitchen chair until the coffee turned cold, watching the faint reflection of the highway lights flicker across the window, and I started thinking about how it all began. I was 25 when I first got behind the wheel of a truck, no experience, no connections, just a need to provide for 2 small children after their father walked away. People told me it was not a job for a woman, especially not a young mother. But I did not have the luxury of choosing comfort. I chose miles, long, endless miles. I learned how to read weather patterns across the Midwest, how to stay awake through the quiet hours between 2 and 5 in the morning when the road feels like it belongs to ghosts, how to eat from gas stations without getting sick, how to sleep sitting up in a cab while engines hummed around me. I missed school plays, birthday candles, first days of school. I remember once calling home from a payphone outside a truck stop in Kansas, listening to my daughter describe her dance recital while I stared at a parking lot full of trailers. I told her I would be there next time. There was always a next time, until there was not, but I kept telling myself it would mean something in the end. Every paycheck I did not spend, every dollar I saved, every investment I made slowly, carefully. I was not reckless with money. I was patient. I bought small properties when I could, nothing flashy, just steady income. I contributed to my retirement accounts, I learned to read contracts, I trusted numbers more than people, and over time, it grew. Not overnight, Not by luck, but by repetition, discipline, sacrifice. That was the word I used back then, sacrifice. I thought it was something noble, something that built a future you could hand to your children like a finished gift. I never thought about what would happen if the people you were building it for stopped seeing it that way. As the sky outside my kitchen window slowly shifted from black to gray, I realized something else. This was not sudden. This had been happening while I was still on the road, still working, still believing everything was exactly where I left it, which meant every phone call, every visit, every smile I had received over the past 2 years had been layered over something else. Something quiet, something intentional. I stood up finally and rinsed my mug in the sink, watching the water swirl away. There was no rush in my movements, no panic, just a slow, steady clarity settling in. I had spent 2 decades learning how to stay calm under pressure, how to make decisions without emotion when the road demanded it, and this felt no different, except this time, the road was inside my own home. I did not call them the next morning. I did not send a message or ask a question. I made breakfast the same way I always did when I was home, 2 eggs, 1 slice of toast, black coffee. I sat at the same kitchen table, but everything felt slightly different, like the air had shifted just enough for me to notice. Not heavier, not lighter, just clearer. I finished eating, washed my plate, and then I opened my laptop again, this time not as a habit, but with intention. I went through every account slowly, line by line, transaction by transaction. Dates, amounts, locations. Patterns began to form, payments to unfamiliar vendors, transfers between accounts I did not recognize, subscriptions that had never been mine. I wrote everything down in a small notebook I kept in the drawer, the same one I used years ago to track fuel expenses and mileage, the same discipline, the same patience, no emotion, just observation. By the time the sun was fully up, I knew this had not been careless. This had been organized, careful enough to avoid attention, consistent enough to empty everything over time. I closed the notebook and sat back. There was only one question left. Who had access? I already knew the answer before I said it out loud. Jason. He had helped me set up online access years ago when everything started moving to digital. I remembered how proud he looked explaining it to me, how he said it would make things easier, safer. I trusted him because he was my son, because I thought trust was something that did not need to be measured. I picked up my phone and looked at his name on the screen. I did not press call. Instead, I scrolled through our messages, short conversations, quick check-ins, nothing too personal. I noticed how often the topic of money came up without me realizing it at the time. Questions about investments, about timing, about whether I planned to retire soon. Small things that felt normal then, but now they felt different. Like pieces of a conversation I had not fully understood. Around noon, my phone rang. It was him. I watched it ring for a few seconds before answering. My voice sounded normal, steady. He asked how I was, if I had gotten back from my trip safely. I told him yes. There was a pause, just a second too long. Then he asked if I had checked my accounts recently. The question landed quietly, not loud, not aggressive, just careful. I felt something settle inside me at that moment. Not anger, not even disappointment, just certainty. I said I had been too tired and would probably look later. He let out a small breath, almost too soft to notice. We talked for another minute about nothing important. Weather, work, routine. Then the call ended. I placed the phone back on the table and stared at it for a while. I did not need more proof. I did not need a confession. I had driven enough miles in my life to recognize when something was off long before it became obvious, and this was not a mistake. This was a decision, repeated over and over again. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the empty road in front of my house. For the first time in years, I was not thinking about where I needed to go next. I was thinking about what needed to be done. The next morning I drove into town earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere urgent to be, but because I needed to move. Sitting still was never how I handled problems, not on the road, and not now. The bank opened at 9, and I was there at 8:45, parked across the street, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel out of habit. I watched people come and go, some in a hurry, some not. Normal life, the kind of life I thought I had built for my children. When the doors opened, I walked in without hesitation, the same way I used to walk into dispatch offices, calm, prepared, knowing exactly what I needed. I asked to speak with a manager, not loudly, not urgently, just directly. A man in his 40s came out, polite, professional, the kind of person who assumes everything is routine until it is not. I handed him my identification and asked him to pull up every account connected to my name, all of them, checking, savings, investment, retirement. He nodded and began typing. The screen turned toward him, but I watched his face instead. It did not take long. His expression shifted slightly, not alarmed, but attentive. He started asking questions, simple at first. Whether I had authorized recent transfers, whether anyone else had access to my accounts. I answered carefully. I told him that years ago, I had allowed my son to help me manage online access, that I trusted him. The manager paused for a moment, then continued reviewing the transaction history, page after page, small withdrawals, recurring transfers, structured movement of funds. He explained that whoever had done this understood how to avoid triggering automatic alerts. The amounts stayed just below thresholds, spaced out over time, not random, intentional. I listened without interrupting. I had already come to that conclusion myself. Hearing it confirmed did not change how I felt, it only made it clearer. He asked if I wanted to file a formal dispute. I told him not yet. His eyebrows lifted slightly, surprised. Most people react quickly when money disappears. Fear, anger, urgency. But I was not most people. I had spent too many years making decisions on highways where hesitation could cost you everything. I asked instead for full documentation, printed records, detailed statements, timestamps, access logs, everything. He agreed and said it would take some time to compile. I told him I would wait. I sat in the lobby for nearly an hour, flipping through a magazine without reading a single word. My mind was not racing, it was organizing. When he returned, he handed me a thick envelope. I thanked him, stood up, and walked out into the cool morning air. The sky was clear, the kind of blue you only notice when you are not in a hurry. I placed the envelope on the passenger seat of my truck and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. This was no longer a question of what happened. That part was already answered. This was about what came next. And for the first time since I opened that account the night before, I allowed myself to think one step further ahead, not as a mother, but as someone who had just seen the full map. I did not open the envelope right away. I drove home first, the same familiar roads I had taken for years, but everything felt slightly sharper now, like I was seeing it without the filter I used to carry. When I pulled into my driveway, I left the engine running for a few seconds, listening to the low hum, the same sound that had followed me across states and seasons. Then I turned it off, picked up the envelope, and walked inside. I set it on the kitchen table and stood there for a moment, just looking at it. It was heavier than I expected, not just paper, but proof. I finally sat down and opened it carefully, spreading the pages out in front of me, line after line, date after date, account numbers, transfer routes, digital signatures. It was all there, not hidden, not erased, just quiet. I traced one transaction with my finger, then another. The pattern became undeniable. Access times that matched when I knew I was on the road, hundreds of miles away, locations tied to where my son lived, not where I was, and then there were the authorizations. My name, my credentials, but not my actions. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. This was not confusion, not misunderstanding. This was someone stepping into my place, using what I had given them, and moving through my life as if it belonged to them. I thought about the years I had trusted him to help me with things I did not fully understand. Passwords, security questions, recovery emails, all the small details that seemed harmless at the time. I had handed over convenience, and somewhere along the way, that turned into control. I gathered the papers back into a neat stack and tapped them lightly against the table to align the edges, the same way I used to organize delivery manifests before a long run. Everything in order, everything accounted for. I was not shaking. I was not overwhelmed. I was focused, because now I knew something else. This was not just about what had already been taken, it was about what they thought they could still take. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet, reaching for an old folder I had not opened in years. Inside were documents I had prepared quietly, long before any of this happened, not because I expected betrayal, but because I believed in being prepared. Retirement plans, property deeds, trust agreements, things I had set up with a lawyer after my husband passed, back when I realized that life does not always follow the path you expect. I flipped through the pages slowly. Confirming what I already remembered, most of what I had built was no longer sitting in those accounts. It had been moved, legally, carefully, into structures that required more than just a password to access. What they had been taking was only part of the picture. I closed the folder and placed it next to the envelope on the table, side by side, what was gone and what remained, and for the first time since this began, I felt something close to calm, not relief, not satisfaction, just clarity, because now I understood the difference between what they thought they had and what they actually controlled. I did not rush into anything. I had learned a long time ago that the worst decisions are the ones made too quickly. Instead, I sat at that kitchen table for hours, going back and forth between the envelope from the bank and the folder from my closet, letting the full picture settle into place. What they had taken was real, but it was not everything, and more importantly, it told me exactly how they thought, careful, patient, confident that I would not notice, confident that I would trust them long enough to let it continue. That kind of thinking does not stop on its own, it grows. I knew that if I did nothing, they would come back for the rest, not with force, not with confrontation, but with the same quiet method they had already used. Small steps, steady movement, until there was nothing left. I stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the empty stretch of road in front of my house. I had driven thousands of roads like that, long, straight, with nothing around for miles, and I knew what it meant when you did not adjust your direction early. You could end up hundreds of miles off course before you even realized it. I turned back toward the table and picked up my phone, not to call my son, not yet. I opened my contacts and scrolled until I found the name of the attorney I had worked with years ago. I had not spoken to him in a long time, but I remembered his voice, calm, precise, the kind of person who paid attention to details the way I did. I pressed call, he answered after 2 rings. I introduced myself and there was a brief pause before recognition settled in. We spoke for a few minutes, nothing dramatic, just facts. I told him I needed to review my existing arrangements, that I had concerns about account access and asset protection. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply suggested we meet in person the next morning. I agreed. After the call ended, I set the phone down and felt something shift again. Not emotional, not heavy, just a sense of movement, like shifting gears after a long stretch of flat road. I spent the rest of the evening organizing everything, documents in one pile, notes in another, timelines written out clearly. I listed every transaction, every date, every pattern I had observed, not because I needed to prove it to myself, but because I was preparing to show it to someone who would understand the full weight of it when I finished. I looked at the 2 stacks on the table, what had been taken, and what was still protected. Side by side, they told a story, not just of loss, but of intent. I turned off the lights and went to bed, not expecting sleep, but it came anyway. Steady, uninterrupted, the kind of rest you get when a decision has already been made, because I was no longer trying to understand what happened. I was preparing for what came next. The next morning I left the house before sunrise, not because I needed the extra time, but because I wanted the quiet, the kind of quiet that lets you think clearly without interruption. The attorney's office was about 40 minutes away. A small building tucked between a dental clinic and an insurance agency. Nothing impressive from the outside, but I had learned a long time ago that appearances do not tell you much. I walked in right on time, carrying the envelope and the folder, both held firmly under my arm like they had weight beyond paper. He greeted me the same way I remembered, calm, direct, no unnecessary small talk. We sat down across from each other, and I placed everything on the table between us. I did not rush through explanations. I did not add emotion. I simply walked him through the facts, the accounts, the transfers, the access, the timeline. He listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, occasionally asking a question that cut straight to the point. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, not uncomfortable, just measured. Then he leaned back slightly and folded his hands. He told me that what I had described was serious, not just a misunderstanding or a mistake, but a pattern of unauthorized control. He explained that there were options, legal ones, that could address what had already happened, but what mattered more was protecting what remained. I nodded. That was exactly why I was there. We went through my existing arrangements next, the trust, the properties, the accounts that had been structured differently. He reviewed each document carefully, confirming what I already knew. Those assets were protected, not easily accessed, not without direct authorization that had never been given. He looked up at me and said something I did not expect. He said that whoever had taken the money likely believed they were getting close to the full amount, that they would not stop now, they would continue. I did not react, but I understood, because I had already come to the same conclusion. We discussed what could be done moving forward, changes to access, additional layers of protection, formal notices that could be issued if necessary. But there was something else, something quieter. I asked him a simple question: what would happen if I chose not to act immediately, if I allowed things to continue, just long enough to see how far it would go? He studied me for a moment before answering. He said it was possible, but it required careful planning, documentation, timing, clarity, not emotion. I almost smiled at that, because emotion had already left the equation. We spent the next hour outlining steps, not dramatic ones, not confrontational, controlled, deliberate. When I finally stood up to leave, everything felt aligned in a way it had not before. Not because the situation was resolved, but because it was understood. I stepped outside into the cool morning air, the sun just beginning to rise over the buildings. I took a deep breath and walked to my truck. As I started the engine, I realized something had changed. I was no longer reacting to what had happened. I was preparing for what I was about to do. For the next few days, I did exactly what I had always done. Nothing looked different from the outside. I made my morning coffee, checked the weather, listened to the same radio station while I drove into town. If anyone had been watching, they would have seen routine, not suspicion, not change, and that was exactly what I wanted. I did not block access to the accounts. I did not send warnings. I did not confront anyone. Instead, I let things continue, quietly, carefully, the way they had been doing it. Every evening I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and my notebook beside me. I tracked every new movement, every transaction, every small withdrawal that slipped through like it had before, except now I was paying attention. I was measuring not just the money, but the behavior, the timing, the consistency. It did not take long to see that nothing had changed on their end, which meant they still believed everything was under control, that I was still unaware. I received a call from my daughter Emily 2 days later. Her voice sounded warm, casual, asking how I was doing, if I had plans for the weekend. I answered the same way I always did, calm, steady, giving her nothing to question. Then she asked about my next work trip, when I would be out on the road again. The question was simple, but it carried weight. I told her I might take some time off, just a few days. There was a pause on the line, brief, almost invisible. Then she said that sounded like a good idea. We ended the call with the usual words, nothing out of place. But I understood something new in that moment. They were not just taking money. They were watching my schedule, adjusting their actions around my absence, using time as part of their strategy. That evening I reviewed the accounts again, and there it was, another transfer. Slightly larger this time, as if confidence had grown, as if the lack of resistance had been interpreted as permission. I wrote it down, added it to the pattern, and closed the notebook. The next morning I met with my attorney again, not to react, but to finalize. We documented everything, dates, amounts, communications, each detail placed in order. Each piece of evidence secured. There was no urgency in the room, only precision. We discussed timing, not just when to act, but how, and more importantly, where. I suggested something simple, a family dinner, nothing unusual, something they would not question. He nodded slowly, understanding immediately, because the truth does not need to be forced. It only needs the right moment to be seen. When I left his office, I did not feel heavier. I felt lighter, not because the situation had improved, but because it had become clear, completely clear. I drove home under a bright afternoon sky, the road stretching out in front of me the way it always had, but this time I was not thinking about distance. I was thinking about timing, and for the first time since this began, I knew exactly when everything would come to a stop. The evening of the dinner arrived quietly, just like everything else in the past few days. I set the table the same way I always had, plates evenly spaced, glasses aligned, nothing out of place. From the outside, it looked like any other family night, normal, expected. Jason arrived first, casual, relaxed, carrying a small dessert from the grocery store. Emily followed shortly after, smiling, asking about my week, her voice light, easy. They both moved through the house like they always had, familiar, comfortable, like nothing had changed, and in a way, for them, nothing had. We sat down together, the three of us, and started eating. Small talk filled the space, work, weather, routine, the kind of conversation that does not require attention. I listened more than I spoke, watching instead of reacting, noticing the small things, the way Jason checked his phone once, quickly, the way Emily asked about whether I planned to start driving again soon, subtle, careful, practiced. I let the conversation move naturally until it reached a quiet pause. Then I stood up without saying anything and walked to the kitchen counter. I picked up the envelope and the folder, held them for a moment, then brought them back to the table. I placed them down in front of me, not dramatically, not forcefully, just deliberately. Both of them looked at the papers, then at me, confusion at first, then something else. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply opened the envelope and turned a few pages toward them. Dates, numbers, transactions, clear, undeniable. I let the silence stretch for a few seconds before speaking. I asked a single question. Did you think I would not notice? No anger, no volume, just clarity. Jason's face shifted, the confidence fading just enough to reveal what had been underneath. Emily looked down at the table, her hands still. Neither of them spoke immediately. They did not need to. Everything was already there. I tapped the second folder lightly, and then I told them something they had not expected. What you took was never everything. Their eyes lifted at the same time, confusion again, but deeper now. I explained slowly, calmly. Most of what I built had already been placed into protected structures years ago. What they had been accessing was only a portion, accessible, visible, and now documented. I did not threaten. I did not demand. I simply laid out the truth the same way I had laid out miles across a map for years. Direct, precise, complete. The room felt different after that. Not louder, just heavier with understanding. Jason finally spoke, something about misunderstanding, about thinking it was allowed. I did not interrupt. I let him finish. Then I closed the folder and placed both hands on the table, steady, still. I told them I was not there to argue, and I was not there to fix what they had done. I was there because now I understood who they had become, and that changed everything. I stood up slowly, leaving the papers where they were. I did not wait for another response. I walked to the door, opened it, and paused for just a moment, not to look back, but to let the silence settle. Then I stepped outside into the night air, calm, clear, because in the end, they did not take what mattered most. They simply revealed it.